My name is Jesse Hamer, and I am a student at Dakota State University studying special education. I'm going to be talking about early learning for students with disabilities, legislation that led to special education, who has a disability, the categories of disabilities, your right as a parent, the assessment process, the IEP process, services that may be provided, and South Dakota's parents' rights. The Brown versus Board of Education is a great place to start when it comes to special education history. However, beforehand, it seemed like many children were denied access to public schools. Um, it wasn't unheard of these children not to attend school, and they often remained at home. It was up to their parents to educate them and teach them basic life skills. I also found with research that there were private, they could go to private schools. However, the cost was um, outrageous. So a lot of the education did come from home, and it did not get them ready for basic life skills. Legislation that led to special education today. Without legislation, we wouldn't have special education as we know it today. Um, there are several wonderful sites out there that talk about the history of special education. I found one in particular that kind of breaks it down and says exactly um, when and where and how things happen. So I'm just going to read you a little bit from the site. Um, the big one is Brown versus Board of Education, which actually is a civil rights decision, and I guess that one was a little surprising to me. I until recently I didn't kind of put that together, um, but it was more than just a race thing. It was definitely um, appropriate education for everyone. So in 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court issued the landmark civil rights decision, the Brown versus Board of Education. In Brown, school children from four states argued that segregated public schools were inherently unequal and deprived them of equal protection of the law. Um, and this actually this is what started legislative action for special education. The next big one that this site talks about is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. Um, Congress enacted the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or ESEA, in 1965 to address inequality of education opportunities for underprivileged children. This landmark legislation provided resources to help ensure that disadvantaged students had access to quality education. Um, from before, when we're talking about special education before Brown versus Board, a lot of it, a lot of it was special education was for those underprivileged children, not specifically for those with specific needs, much as education or special education is today. Um, and then in 1966, Congress amended the ESEA to establish a grant program to help in the initiation, expansion, and improvement of programs and projects for the education of handicapped children, not just underprivileged, but also handicapped children. The next one is the PARC and Mills. During the early 1970s, two cases were catalysts for change. Pennsylvania Association for Retarded Children versus Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. That's the PARC. And Mills versus Board of Education of Columbia. The PARC dealt with the exclusion of children with mental retardation from public schools. In a subsequent settlement, it was agreed that the education placement decisions must include a process of parental participation and means to resolve disputes. So that's where we'll get into IDEA, but they found that it was important for parents to be participants in the special education of their children. Mills involved the practice of suspending, expelling, or excluding children with disabilities from the District of Columbia Public Schools. This is kind of another big one. Children with disabilities, children with behaviors, are constantly being kicked out of schools, and it's their disability. So that was protected. Then the congressional investigation of 1972. After the Park and Mills, Congress launched an investigation into the status of children with disabilities and found that millions of children were not receiving appropriate education. There's that word appropriate, which we'll get into IDEA as well again. But this has been an awesome project for me because I can see how this legislative process has built the special education that I know today. Um, and let's see, Public Law 94 142, the Education of All Handicapped Children Act of 1975. On November 19th, 1975, Congress enacted Public Law 94 142, also known as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975. Congress intended that all children with disabilities would have a right to education, to establish a process by which the state and local educational agencies may be held accountable for providing educational services for all handicapped children. 13 categories of disability. Next, I'd like to talk about what is considered disability, or categories of disability. I have a list here, which I got from the website that I cited below, and this actually breaks it down. The site breaks it down and gives definitions. I'm only going to touch on a couple. The first one is autism. Which means a developmental disability significantly affecting verbal and nonverbal communication and social interactions, generally evident before the age of 3. It has that adversely affects a child's educational performance. Other characteristics often associated with autism are engaging in repetitive activities and stereotype movements, resistance to environmental change and or change in daily routines, and unusual response to sensory experiences. The term autism does not apply to a child's educational performance is adversely affected primarily because the child has emotional disturbance, as defined in number 5 below, which actually, I'll jump down right there to an emotional disturbance, which is the 5th on the list there. This is emotional disturbance means a condition exhibiting one or more of the following characteristics over a long period of time and to a marked degree that adversely affects the child's educational performance. And you're going to hear me say that adversely affects a child's educational performance several times. A is the inability to learn that cannot be explained by intellectual, sensory, or health factors. B, the inability to build or maintain satisfactory interpersonal relationship with peers and teachers. C, inappropriate types of behaviors or feelings under normal circumstances. D, a general mood of unhappiness or depression. E, a tendency to develop physical symptoms of fears associated with personal or school problems. The term includes schizophrenia. The term does not apply to children who are socially maladjusted unless it is determined that they have an emotional disturbance. Um, and actually, uh, a lot of times when talking to students outside the special education classroom, and sometimes parents believe that special education has a look. You have to look like a specific thing to be in the special education classroom, and that is completely false. Um, you cannot see emotional disturbance. There are no physical characteristics to that. Developmentally delayed. This is for children from birth to age 3 under the IDEA Part C, and the child from ages 3 through 9 under IDEA Part B. The term developmentally delay, as defined by each state, means a delay in one or more of the following areas: physical development, cognitive development, communication, social or emotional development, or adaptive behavior development. And the last one I'm going to touch on um, is going to be. Let me see if I can find it. Here we go. Speech or language impairment. This means a communication disorder such as stuttering, impaired articulation, a language impairment, or voice impairment that adversely affects a child's educational performance. And there's that adversely affects again. Uh, a lot of these say that because that's what gets a child into the special education program, is that uh, it adversely affects their learning, and that's the biggest thing that I got out of um, this part of the project, is that a special education student is in there because whatever their situation is adversely affecting them in their education. Up next is the assessment process of special education. The assessment process is actually quite quite a long process. It's broken down into different things. First has to come the referral, and the referral can be made by teachers, by parents, by doctors, or anyone who are involved in the student's education. Before the child is placed in special education, an assessment must be completed to determine their academic level, cognitive ability, adaptive behavior, motor skills, or language processing abilities. Excuse me. This is where the assessments are done, and can be conducted by the special education teachers, school specialists, and those are broken down into different categories. There's the vision and hearing screening, that's usually performed by the school nurse. Loss of hearing or vision must be ruled out as a cause for academic delays. Cognitive assessment, performed by the school's psychologist. And this involves an intelligent test and one or more tests of information processing. So that'd be auditory, listening, visual, sensory, motor, memory, or attention processing, and that just helps explore the child's cognitive strengths and weaknesses. Observations are done, informal tests are done during this time as well. Then there's the academic assessment. This is performed by the special education teacher, and it usually means administering a standardized test of academic achievement in reading, writing, math, and mathematics, as well as reviewing work samples that they've already done from the classroom. Developmental, medical, and school history is performed by the school psychologist. They get report cards, they reports together, attendance, discipline, records, and they are all collected and studied. Parents, teachers, and students are interviewed to understand the health, developmental behavior, and social, emotional functioning of the student, and its impact on school performance. And then there's the speech and language assessment. That's usually done by the speech pathologist. Um, and if there's any suspected language processing or communication problems, the speech pathologist will use a standardized test of repetitive language, expressive language ability, and language pragmatics, and articulation. Last is there's a motor skills assessment that's performed by the OT, or the occupational therapist. Assessments of gross and fine motor skills are conducted when they appear to be a physical limitation of the child. And actually, all these people, usually once on an IEP, all these people are still part of the team and still work with the child. So they get everybody who could or would work with a child involved in the actual assessment process. And then finally, the results. And that's just where the IEP is written. They have their meeting with the parents and all of the team. And this is the IEP is where the strengths and the weaknesses come into play quite a bit. And any recommendations for services are all on the IEP. And that is the assessment process for your child in special education.